Let us bow in prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of each of our hearts be found acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Really going to share just a little bit with you about General Assembly, the national gathering of the Presbyterian Church this past week, around the theme that perhaps would guide our thinking. What do Presbyterians care about? What do Presbyterians care about enough to travel all the way across the country, as almost everyone did, to Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, to have a wonderful time of national gathering at the General Assembly? What out of that 5 days together did I see that suggest to me they are the things that Presbyterians care about? I just want to share a few of these with you today. Not really so much a sermon as I think a bit of guidance and insight into who we are and what we're about as a church across Canada these days. What do Presbyterians care about? Well, let me tell you, first of all, they care about who your father is. Every conversation, I think I can safely say, in Cape Breton that I had over this past week with a Cape Bretoner or a Maritimer would begin with this phrase. So, who's your father? And I guess I kind of enjoyed those conversations because I could immediately jump into it, and it's great to have Mum with us here before she heads home later today. Being a Nova Scotianer herself, and so 50% of me is kind of Nova Scotian, the other half's from Toronto, and as I told the gathering last week, that means that part of me is Nova Scotian too because, well, for a long, long time, most of the population of Cape Bretoners in the world lived in Toronto, if not in Cape Breton themselves. So yes, I love that kind of question. But it was an exciting one because it really said something about the nature of our church as a rather small family. At the airport, as we were getting ready to head back Friday night, we stood beside the principal of Knox College, Dr. Dorcas Gordon. And she said she feels rather strange sometimes in those discussions because she came to Canada in only the 1950s as an immigrant from Ireland. And so she doesn't have too many brothers and sisters, certainly doesn't have any parents in Canada, and so has a more difficult time answering that question. Have you heard about the six levels of connectedness? I think it's a bit of a theory that if you talk to 6 people, you'll probably find one of them is somehow or other related to you. Well, in Cape Breton, you only have to ask about 2 people before you find, at least 2 Presbyterians, before you find somebody that is related to you. And so certainly that was something that Presbyterians at the General Assembly cared about in a wonderfully celebrative way in terms of the family nature of our denomination and certainly our gathering in the Maritimes. Well, I can certainly tell you very pointedly, anyone who was at the Cape Breton Assembly would say the same thing, that Presbyterians also, believe it or not, care about having fun. Not necessarily a thing Presbyterians would be known for, but that was definitely the case as we gathered in Cape Breton. The opening night of General Assembly is always a wonderful banquet. Marilyn, you attended the banquet last year, I think, in Hamilton. Well, this one was a uniquely Cape Breton experience. Almost everyone there who enjoyed lobster was able to have lobster. I feel quite bad to tell you that I only ate lobster 3 times in the last week, and enjoyed all of it because it was definitely very fresh, just off the boats in many cases. But Presbyterians really do enjoy having fun. 500 gathered at the opening banquet in a wonderful conference center owned by the Mi'kmaq Indians right in the middle of Sydney, Nova Scotia, and had a wonderful evening of celebrating joy and celebrating the music of Cape Breton, which is such a wonderful experience. None of us going into that banquet knew what would be on the lineup in terms of entertainment, and we were delightfully entertained by a number of Cape Breton singers, some Mi'kmaq Indians, who weren't necessarily the brightest lights coming out of Cape Breton, but they were wonderful. But then at the end of the evening, as we thought perhaps we were winding down, who comes onto the stage but the Men of the Deep? World-famous Cape Breton men's choir, all former coal miners, and they sang and they sang. They said they were going to sing for 45 minutes. Well, that passed, and we kept doing so many encores, I think it was an hour and a half. And you know many of the songs, Rise Again and Coal Miner, and just amazing time. And we just celebrated in wonderful fashion with the people of Cape Breton. Perhaps one of the most wonderful aspects was the presentation by a Highland dancer, like you've never seen before. This was a gentleman who was kind of dressed like a Highland dancer, but he was a comedian. And he sang the funniest songs about Cape Breton that you can just imagine, all the time dancing around and being silly. Then he disappeared, someone else sang, and he reappeared again. We only knew it was the same person because the program said it was Dan Gartschel the second time. This time the man came out and sang Josh Groban's hit song, On My Shoulder, You Raise Me Up, and the Lord's Prayer. He is an incredibly gifted singer. You can only be that bad if you're that good, we concluded. But Dan Gartschel was a wonderful presentation. So Presbyterians, believe it or not, do care about having fun. But they also care about doing the work of the church. And let me just tell you a few of the most significant debates. Now, my son asked me when I first got home, what did you do at General Assembly this year in terms of business? Well, keep in mind, Presbyterians are very good at discussing things, and then at the end of the discussion they say, well, we should probably discuss this some more, so we'll have them discuss it next year as well. And so, in fact, most of these things that I'll just tell you about briefly, we probably didn't end the discussion. We just kind of started it and passed it on to the church to discuss more, and that's perhaps all right as well. One of the things that Presbyterian Church in Canada really cares about of a serious nature is all its members receiving communion. Now, we here in southern, south central Ontario don't have much of a problem that way. There's ministers scattered around and a few ministers who are retired, like Don, who can help with communion in most congregations in southern Ontario and southern Canada. But we heard about many, many parts of the country where there are not enough ministers. In northern Ontario, the northern Ontario, up north of North Bay, there is currently only one minister for 6 or 7 Presbyterian churches. And if you've been in that the northern Ontario part, you know it's miles and miles, hours and hours of driving between Timmins and Cochrane and Temiskaming and Kirkland Lake. One minister for all those churches. Same thing for northern British Columbia, same thing for northern Prairie provinces, same thing in many cases in remote parts of the Maritimes as well. We heard that again and again as people talked about how passionately they felt we should do something to resolve that. And the issue that came up was, could we ordain or commission lay missionaries who could be given the blessing of the church to do the sacraments out there in the far-flung parts of Canada? As you can understand, this would have been a very difficult and passionate kind of discussion. We didn't resolve it. We're going to talk about it more back at the Presbyterian session levels. But Presbyterians really do care about the sacraments, really do care that all their brothers and sisters across Canada receive equally the benefits of coming to the table of the Lord, as we do, as we will do in just a few minutes today. Another thing that Presbyterians care about deeply is about issues around ministers coming into our church from other parts of the world, other parts of Christ's vineyard. And how do we welcome in new ministers or perhaps students for ministry from other denominations, other countries, other continents, and try to bring them into the flock so that they understand what the Presbyterian Church of Canada is all about in its character and its nature and its beliefs. And again, we had passionate sharing around this issue because we recognize that there are wonderfully gifted men and women of God all across this globe, in China, in India, in other parts of Christ's kingdom, who feel perhaps led in some way or other to serve Christ in Canada, in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And they would like to get on with that and not be told, well, we'll let you do that, but you have to study at Knox College for the next 2 or 3 years before we'll welcome you in. And many people can't afford to do that. And so we lose them to our church. So this is a critical issue, but one, again, that we didn't resolve and we're going to keep talking about. But it's a very important one. I heard again and again, one of the distinctives of our Presbyterian Church is that we want our ministers to be trained as highly as possible. And that is certainly something we're committed to and want to maintain.